The Cold War begins. Following the dropping of the atomic bomb and the end of World War II, the great powers of the war will get together and hash everything out, as we'll look at. But the main thing we need to understand is that the Cold War gets its name from the idea that it is not a hot war. It's not an actual fighting event. So the United States and the Soviet Union for the next several decades will face off toe-to-toe through proxy wars and diplomacy and all sorts of other aspects to sort of wage a shadow war with each other over whose social philosophy was better. And so this gets going in the 1950s following the aftermath of the Second World War. So at the Yalta Conference, the big three get together. We have Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. Now, this isn't the final conference. We looked at that in the previous presentation. One of the final conferences is going to be the Potsdam Conference. But at the Yalta Conference, the important thing is they kind of make decisions on what's going to happen. So, as you'll see, they will make a decision on dividing up of Germany, which we'll look at in a few slides. But basically, they'll divide it up into different sectors. You'll have the Allied sector divided up between the United States, the UK, and France. The French portion, right, is divvied up from the UK and American sections. And then in the eastern section, you'll have the Soviet Union. They also agreed to have free elections in the territories that were now liberated and in Germany and stuff like that for their leaders. Also, Russia agreed to jump into the war on the side of the Allies following the victory in Europe and help defeat the Japanese. Now, a couple points here. One, the Soviet Union never allows these free elections to occur. They either just directly install their guys or have sham elections where the Soviet Party really didn't run against anybody, and they made sure that those countries would be communist and become a buffer between the West and the Soviet Union. Also, Russia never really had to come into the war against Japan. We dropped the atomic bomb, right? So they never actually have to enter into the war, and they're going to insert their influence in the East a little bit because there were deals that were made that were supposed to help the Russians out for helping us out. Now, as it says right here, polar opposites and social philosophies. Social philosophies, I should say. The Soviet Union, right, is what we refer to as communist. Or communism, right? Karl Marx said that communism was basically an evolution out of capitalism, and the idea was that the working masses would no longer put up with their sort of subjugation by the capitalists, the capital owners, or the bourgeoisie, right? They would overthrow them and thus create this. And the Soviet Union itself, the idea is that you have Soviets, which were councils, and that a union of councils is kind of what the idea was behind this, and the ideas of communes and so forth, and we get to communism. We'll talk about it more in class. You'll learn about it in government next year. But it's sort of polar opposites or diabolically opposed to the United States and its ideas of democracy, right, and the free market, capitalism. So the idea, talking about this, we don't have a ton of time, try to keep these lectures short, but in the Soviet Union, the government controls everything. They control all the factors of production is what it's called, okay? And, production, namely what we refer to as land, labor, and capital. And so in the United States, those are not owned by the government. They're owned by individuals, and individuals make choices, and that's what runs our economy. Since the government kind of controls everything in terms of land, labor, and capital, namely, if we think about labor, right, they want their workers to be good workers, and they don't want them to sort of have, free, open minds, because then that might cause problems. And so, as we see, these ideas are just opposite of one another, right? Where in our free market system, right, we sort of champion the individual and the person who takes risks, where that's not going to be something that they want to have happen in a communist country. Besides those philosophies, and besides the differences in our sort of makeup, we didn't tell them about the atomic bomb, right? So we kept that secret from them. Also, at the end of the war, when the United States was dishing out money to rebuild Europe, the Soviet Union wanted a loan as well. We ceased giving them any aid. So we don't tell them about the bomb. We don't give them any aid. We have these different ideas. And then lastly, we have missionary diplomacy. Missionary diplomacy basically meant we sent out people trying to spread our ideas. Okay? And since our ideas are against one another effectively, this is going to lead to a sort of competitive nature between these two countries. And this is what gets us into the thickening of the Cold War. The idea of, China is going to fall to the communists, Cuba, so forth and so on. And so that means that we need to have control in certain places so that way, say, South Korea, so that way we can hold on to these places for democracy and capitalism and sort of counteract, or as we'll see, contain communism. Out of the Second World War, we'll get the United Nations. The United Nations will be opposite, or not opposite, but different from the League of Nations. The League of Nations, right, everybody was equal, and in that anyone could veto anyone else. So little Switzerland could veto big Soviet Union kind of idea. And that was really kept to keep them on an equal footing, to keep them from, yet again, kind of like getting overzealous and working against each other. The United Nations is built upon the idea of cooperation. And so also it makes the Security Council, which means that these 5 members, England or the United Kingdom, France, the Soviet Union, now Russia, the United States, and China, are permanent members on the Security Council and have a veto power over bills or movements or whatever they're called in the United Nations. And there's going to be rotating members that come into this as well. As I said before, they have veto power. Unlike the League of Nations, the Senate will overwhelmingly approve the United Nations. The headquarters, it was actually founded in San Francisco, but the headquarters is in New York City. Now, what to do with Germany after the war? So, in Nuremberg, you're going to start to have trials where they rounded up war criminals. So think SS officers, people that were in concentration camps, all that sort of stuff. And they would try them publicly. You can still go and watch the tapes of these trials. And the idea was, right, that these guys needed to be put on trial to show that this isn't right. They're also going to outlaw Nazism in general and make it a crime to deny that the Holocaust didn't happen. At the University of Missouri in the United States, Sir Winston Churchill will give a rousing speech where he claims that a iron curtain has descended across the continent, basically saying that Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, this western part of the country is now closed off from the rest of the world. Realize communist countries, one, aren't open countries. You can't freely travel where you want to go because a lot of people will just leave those places because they're not necessarily great places to live. Think North Korea, Cuba, that kind of thing. And so also they were going to be closed off because they weren't going to be part of the rest of the sort of international community. And they were dictatorial. They were under the control of the Soviet Union. At the time, this was a very controversial statement, but it kind of comes to define that time and that place. Now, I know we already mentioned this in class, but in East Germany, in the Russian zone, was Berlin, the capital. And the capital itself was going to be represented much like the country as a whole, with a Allied sector and a Russian sector. And they become known as East and West Berlin. And over time, Stalin gets frustrated with the Westerners and cuts off any travel into the country, and then slowly begins to build a wall through the city, and then eventually he will cut off East and West Berlin, causing West Berlin to basically be an island in Soviet-controlled territory. This will start what is referred to as the Berlin Airlift, as you can see in the picture off to the right. Round the clock, for about 15 months, the United States and its allies will fly in supplies into West Berlin to show the resolve of the Allies against communism. And then eventually, Stalin will open up transportation into West Berlin. And the wall will still stand. People can't really go in and out very easily, but he will open it up for people to come enter as necessary. One of the most important things to take away from this chapter slash time period slash if I could hit you in the head with anything, to take away from it is the Truman Doctrine, right? Much like when we've talked about the Monroe Doctrine. They're big, important aspects of a U.S. foreign policy, often dictated by the president. The ambassador to the Soviet Union, named George Kennan, is going to write what is referred to as the Long Telegram. And in the Long Telegram, he's going to talk about the ideas of containing Soviet expansion during the Cold War. And from this, we get the idea of the Truman Doctrine. This idea, as it says right here, it must be the policy of the United States to support the free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. And what Truman is saying is that we must stand in the face of communism, okay? Because generally people don't want communism, and so there's, rowdy people inside their country who are trying to force it to happen, or the Soviet Union is pressuring countries to become communist and to come into their sphere of influence. And so us as a country, we have to take a stand and fight it at every turn. Now, this will be controversial to some extent, but will lead us, will be the policy of the United States throughout the Cold War. So we see this in Vietnam and in Korea. But the idea is, yet again, to stand in the face of communism, to contain it. One of the measures they used to battle communism was monetarily. So the Secretary of State at the time, George Marshall, had the idea to basically ensure that Europe does not become a sort of destitute place like it did following the First World War, which led us into the Second World War. They were afraid that if it was a destitute, economically down place, that it would be ripe for communism to come and set in and, basically destroy Western society. So they spent $12.5 billion to rebuild Europe. The big thing is if you wanted the money, you basically had to ensure the fact that you were going to have, elections and democracy and that kind of idea. And so, as it says right here, they're going to spend this $12.5 billion to ensure a free and liberal Europe. The first place we see this happen, and I should take this back, not necessarily the Marshall Plan, but the first time we see the Truman Doctrine come into hand is in Greece and in Turkey following the Second World War. Both of those places looked like they were going to fall to communism. And so what did we do? We pumped money into their country to support the pro-Western, pro-capitalist, democratic factions, and they went out. And that becomes basically the plan for the foreseeable future for the United States in fighting communism. The Marshall Plan more directly is going to take place in Europe, in Western Europe, and rebuilding, France and England and Belgium and all these countries that had to fight in the war that were going to have problems, and they didn't want to have communism set in. Now, another issue here is following the war, British-controlled Palestine. The British are going to partition part of Palestine and create the Jewish homeland of Israel. A lot of this was felt as a response to the Holocaust, all that sort of stuff. It had been in the books before this, but this is when it happens. Now, even though a lot of people told Truman not to recognize Israel as a country because it was going to alienate Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing countries in the area, Truman goes against everyone and recognizes Israel in the mid-40s. And this is going to cause, Israel's one of our allies in the region, and so it's probably a good thing, but it is going to make a very difficult situation for the United States going forward. America begins to rearm. We are going to pass the National Security Act, which is going to create the Department of Defense, which is now today housed in the Pentagon over there on the banks of the Potomac in Washington, D.C. What this is going to do is create a civilian secretary over the Defense Department, so the Secretary of Defense, getting rid of the old Secretary of War. Each of the branches of the military, the Joint Chiefs as they're referred to, will report to the Secretary, okay, who also will sit on the National Security Council, which will basically provide the president with information about the security of the country. They also created the CIA to be the intelligence gathering and spying network for the United States. And in a big 180 degrees from what we've thought about before, we form and join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, basically tying our future to the countries of the North Atlantic. If you look here, you can see there's some big players. There's England, and these are the current ones or whenever this picture was taken. But at the time, really, it was like England and France and the Netherlands and, those countries, Germany, that kind of stuff, to stand against the Soviet Union. And the idea was very much like, say, World War I, was that an attack against, say, France would be an attack against all of us. That's why today there's some concern over President Trump and his view of NATO and how that's going to go forward. That makes some of these countries uneasy. But to add to that, since the 1940s, the United States has been the leading faction inside of NATO and has stood by NATO. And the major creation of it was for the Cold War, or the possible heating up of the Cold War. Reconstruction and revolution in Asia. Douglas MacArthur, the general, is going to be put in charge of the reconstruction of Japan. Now, it's going to go a lot easier than in Germany, because it's going to be one country, the United States, with one leader, MacArthur, who's going to turn around Japan. They're going to write a pro-USA constitution. The Japanese, are all intents and purposes, are going to get on board with it, and it's going to basically fuel an economic boom for Japan, causing it to be one of the most industrialized nations in the world now. Also during this time period, you're going to have the fall of China. A lot of people feel like the United States let down the basically pro-Westerners, Chiang Kai-shek, and then Jiang, and they will be toppled by Chairman Mao here, and forced onto now the island of Taiwan. So some people see as the true government of China on the island of Taiwan, and the communist government, the people's government, however you want to look at it, as the sort of false government of the current Republic of China. Now, Harry Truman is going to announce to the world that the Soviet Union has created an atomic bomb, and in that he is going to he's going to push for the creation and the eventual adoption of the H-bomb, or the hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb, you can read about down here in the bottom left, is 1,000 times more powerful than the original atomic bombs created. So Einstein and Oppenheimer are going to speak out against it, saying we could destroy the world with this kind of power. But Truman pushes forward with it because he knows that it will give us an advantage over the Soviet Union. Now, we get the Korean War, and we'll look at some more stuff on the Korean War in class, but the basic thing was this. You have the 38th parallel here. The Russians had gotten the Japanese to surrender in the northern region, and the United States has gotten them to surrender down here. Much like Germany, this created a communist portion in the north and a capitalist free portion in the south. Eventually, both groups will leave the region, and when this happens, the communists roll into the south and push back the South Korean forces all the way down here to Busan. Now, there's some debate over if the Russians orchestrated this or not. Supposedly, Stalin didn't want it to happen, but he begrudgingly allowed it to, thinking that this wouldn't be a big deal or will last very long, or that the United States would even care. Harry Truman did care, cared a lot. He is going to call up Douglas MacArthur and his troops in Japan, and they are going to come over and begin to fight in Korea. It's often referred to as the Forgotten War because it's sandwiched between World War II, big famous thing, and then Vietnam, which had a big cultural impact. So what's going to happen is military spending, thanks to NSC 68, is going to go through the roof. And this is going to basically put a wartime footing for the United States for the foreseeable future to fight communism. Instead of pushing back from Busan, Douglas MacArthur will land here at Incheon and then push behind enemy lines and push all the way here to the border of China. thus dragging back the North Korean army. He thought that the Chinese, this is a very fast version of all this, that the Chinese wouldn't put up much resistance or whatever, but the Chinese come down in the droves and push him back, okay, at the chosen reservoir here. Now, since he's defeated by the Chinese, MacArthur is going to come out and say, we need to pull out all the stops and roll into China. He's like, we need to nuke the Chinese, we need to do this, do that, and the other. Harry Truman doesn't want that. He doesn't want to escalate the war. And so he tells MacArthur we're trying to fight a limited war, we don't want to expand it, blah, 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 blah. MacArthur doesn't like this and publicly comes out and criticizes the president. So as he says right there's no substitute for victory, basically says that Truman's being weak, so forth and so on. So Truman can't stand for that, and he basically has to dismiss General MacArthur. There's a video on the website, we'll look at it in class. In the end, it comes back to the 38th parallel. It's where you have South Korea and North Korea today, and you have what was referred to as the demilitarized zone between the two countries. There's a famous building that's, I forget what it's called, but you can enter it from either side of the parallel, and it's there for meetings to discuss, the relations between the two countries, and that's why it straddles the line.